Rio de Janeiro, 1838. To the outside world, it was a jewel of the tropics, a bustling port where ships carried sugar, coffee, and gold across the Atlantic. Merchants in elegant clothes strolled the streets, soldiers patrolled in crisp uniforms, and the sound of church bells mingled with the cries of street vendors. But beneath the surface, Rio was a city built on chains. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans lived and labored here, not hidden away on distant plantations, but in the very heart of the empire's shining capital. They carried water through the streets, hauled goods to the docks, drove carts, cooked meals, and built the very mansions that lined the hills. Everywhere one looked, slavery was not an exception, it was the foundation. And then, in 1838, the city trembled. This time, resistance did not erupt in the sugar fields or in remote jungle hideouts. It exploded in the crowded, narrow streets of Rio itself. Enslaved workers, men and women who knew the city as intimately as any free citizen, rose together in defiance. They had no plantation rows to hide in, no mountains to retreat to. Their battlefield was the marketplace, the alleys, the docks, and the taverns where whispers of rebellion had taken shape. The revolt was short-lived, brutally crushed by soldiers and militias. But for a moment, it revealed a terrifying truth to the Brazilian elite, that slavery's chains were cracking not only in the countryside, but in the empire's beating heart. It was not only fields that could burn, cities too could rise. The Rio Revolt is almost forgotten today, overshadowed by larger and bloodier uprisings. But it matters, because it shows that rebellion was everywhere. It shows that enslaved people were not passive victims, but actors who forced history to reckon with them. And it shows that even in the most controlled of spaces, the streets of a capital city, the dream of freedom could not be silenced. This is the story of how the enslaved of Rio de Janeiro shook an empire. To understand the revolt of 1838, we must first understand Rio de Janeiro itself. This was not a hidden corner of Brazil. This was the capital of the empire, the jewel of Portuguese, and later Brazilian, colonial ambition. By the early 19th century, Rio was one of the busiest slave ports in the world. Ships from Africa arrived regularly, disgorging their human cargo into a city that thrived on bondage. At its heart, Rio was a paradox. On the surface, it was modernizing, cosmopolitan, connected to Europe. Coffee exports surged, merchants grew wealthy, and the city became a hub of culture and power. But beneath that facade lay a grim reality. More than half the population were enslaved Africans or their descendants. Imagine a capital city where the majority of people were not citizens, but property, where the wealth of the elite was measured not only in gold or land, but in the number of human beings they owned. The enslaved in Rio were not confined to plantations far from sight. They were everywhere, in the markets, in the streets, on the docks. They hauled water in heavy barrels, carried the loads of merchants, rowed boats across the bay, and pushed carts laden with coffee. They worked as street sellers, artisans, and domestic servants. Their labor was visible, constant, inescapable. For visitors from Europe, it was shocking to see slavery not as a distant rural institution, but as the very pulse of urban life. This visibility gave enslaved people something rare: knowledge. Unlike isolated plantation workers, enslaved urban laborers could hear rumors, trade news, and observe the vulnerabilities of their masters. They knew the rhythms of the city, its alleys and safe houses, its soldiers and watchmen. They could vanish into a crowd, they could whisper across tavern tables, and they could imagine a different kind of uprising, one that did not depend on escape into jungles, but on taking the fight into the streets. The early 19th century was also a time of global upheaval. Haiti had declared independence in 1804, the first black republic born from a successful slave revolution. Brazil's rulers feared the specter of Haiti, and Rio's enslaved population knew the story well. Other uprisings in Bahia, most famously the Malê Revolt of 1835, led by African Muslims, showed that insurrection was possible, even in cities. For enslaved people in Rio, resistance was not a dream. It was an idea already proven. But the elite of Rio responded with paranoia and brutality. Laws restricted gatherings, curfews were enforced, and rumors of conspiracies were met with swift violence. Yet the repression only deepened resentment. To live in Rio as an enslaved African was to be constantly reminded of one's powerlessness, and yet also to glimpse in every corner the possibility of resistance. Thus, by 1838, the city was a powder keg, a place where poverty, brutality, and the dream of freedom pressed against one another in narrow streets. It was only a matter of time before sparks flew. Life for an enslaved African in Rio was unlike life on a sugar plantation, but no less brutal. In the city, chains were replaced by endless errands, humiliation, and exhaustion. The enslaved were forced into nearly every corner of Rio's economy. They carried water from fountains to households, hauling barrels up steep hills in the tropical heat. They loaded sacks of coffee and sugar onto ships at the docks, their sweat fueling the empire's wealth. They served in kitchens, worked as coachmen, and sold goods in the marketplace, not for themselves, but for their masters who pocketed the profits. The streets of Rio were alive with their presence. At dawn, processions of enslaved water carriers wound through the alleys, yokes digging into their shoulders. Marketplaces buzzed with enslaved women selling fruit and fish, their baskets balanced on weary heads. At the harbor, gangs of dockworkers shouted in African languages as they strained against ropes and crates. The sound of chains was not confined to prisons. It was the background music of the city itself. But within this suffering, there were slivers of opportunity. Urban slavery meant movement. It meant contact with others, freedom of information, and glimpses of the world beyond the master's walls. A plantation slave might never leave the fields, but a street vendor or porter could overhear conversations, share rumors, and build networks. At night, in cramped quarters and hidden taverns, whispers spread. Stories of Haiti, of Bahia, of rebellions that had shaken empires. Language was both barrier and weapon. Many enslaved Africans in Rio still spoke Yoruba, Kikongo, Mandinka, or Hausa alongside Portuguese. Among themselves, they could plan and scheme without their master's understanding. Religion, too, became a shield. Catholic brotherhoods, officially sanctioned by the church, allowed Africans to gather in groups under the guise of worship. Beneath the surface, these spaces became places of solidarity, where bonds of trust and resistance were woven. And then there were the capoeiras. Born from African martial traditions, capoeira was more than dance. It was a disguised form of combat. In Rio's alleys, young enslaved men practiced the art, using rhythm and agility to prepare for fights that might come. To the authorities, it was a nuisance. To the enslaved, it was training. The city's geography offered another advantage. Narrow streets, twisting alleys, and crowded markets created confusion. Soldiers struggled to control the maze of neighborhoods, especially at night. An uprising in the city could spread like fire in dry brush. Enslaved people knew this. They knew the patrol's routines, the weak points in the watch, the blind spots where groups could gather unseen. But none of this erased the violence of daily life. Punishments were public, brutal, designed to intimidate. Whippings were carried out in plazas. Runaways were paraded in chains. Advertisements for fugitive slaves filled newspapers, complete with descriptions of scars, brands, and tribal markings. Children were sold away from mothers. Families were torn apart. Still, in the cracks of oppression, hope survived. Songs carried coded messages. Drums spoke in rhythms that masters could not decipher. A glance, a word, a hand signal. These were tools of communication, the infrastructure of resistance. By 1838, Rio's enslaved population was not simply enduring. They were watching, listening, preparing. Their lives gave them knowledge of the city's heart, and that knowledge would soon become a weapon. By the late 1830s, Rio de Janeiro was a city under tension. On the surface, the empire seemed secure. Coffee exports grew, the ruling elite enjoyed lavish banquets, and the imperial court projected an image of stability. But beneath the marble facades and sunlit plazas, whispers spread like smoke through the alleys. The enslaved majority had not forgotten Haiti. They had not forgotten Bahia, and they had not forgotten that chains could be broken. The Haitian Revolution remained a ghost, haunting every slave society in the Americas. News of it had traveled by sailors, traders, and runaways. For enslaved Africans in Rio, Haiti was not a distant legend. It was proof that enslaved men and women could rise, defeat armies, and build a nation of their own. Planters, meanwhile, lived in dread of another Haiti. The memory of 1804 was an unspoken terror, a nightmare they tried to bury under laws and punishments. But terror cannot erase memory. It only fuels it. Then there was Bahia. In 1835, only 3 years before the Rio Revolt, enslaved African Muslims launched the famous Malê uprising in Salvador. Armed with Quranic verses and a fierce determination, they nearly took the city before being suppressed. The news spread fast across Brazil. In Rio, dockworkers and vendors whispered of Muslim warriors in Bahia who had defied their masters with swords and courage. If Salvador could burn, why not Rio? The seeds of rebellion sprouted in secret gatherings. In the cramped quarters of the enslaved, men and women exchanged stories by candlelight. Taverns became meeting points where plans could be disguised as drunken chatter. Brotherhoods tied to the church offered cover for African solidarity, while behind closed doors, discussions turned to strategy. Who would strike first? Which neighborhoods could be seized? Which masters should fall? Everyday objects became weapons in waiting. Knives from kitchens, sticks from carts, even stones from the streets could be turned against soldiers. Some enslaved workers had access to muskets through their labor in transport or docks. Others relied on the hidden art of capoeira, ready to strike with fists and feet if the chance came. The leaders of the movement were not generals. They were water carriers, dockhands, market sellers, ordinary people who had seen too much suffering to remain silent. Their knowledge of the city's rhythms gave them power. They knew when patrols were thin. They knew where soldiers gathered. They knew which corners of the city were blind to the eyes of authority. Above all, they knew that rebellion was not madness. It was possible. Others had done it. Others had fought, even won. Why not them? By 1838, the soil of Rio was fertile with rage. Hunger, injustice, and memory had become weapons. The enslaved no longer asked if they could resist. They asked when. It began quietly, as revolts so often do. A whisper passed from one quarter to another, carried in the shadows of Rio's narrow alleys. Men gathered after sunset, slipping from their masters' houses, leaving behind the tools of their labor to pick up the weapons of desperation: kitchen knives, clubs, stones, and a few stolen muskets. Women, too, played their part, hiding messages in baskets, carrying food, and watching the movements of soldiers. The city that had seemed so calm by daylight was suddenly a stage set for rebellion. No single church bell announced it, no trumpet sounded. Instead, the uprising flickered to life in multiple corners of the city at once. Near the docks, dock workers turned fighters seized control of warehouses, shouting in Kikongo and Yoruba, their voices echoing over the bay. In the marketplace, enslaved vendors dropped their baskets and raised their blades. In the narrow lanes behind the grand houses of the elite, gangs of capoeiras, fighters trained in the art of rhythm and motion, struck suddenly, overwhelming unsuspecting guards. The city recoiled in shock. Torches flared in the night, casting shadows on whitewashed walls. Shouts of defiance mingled with screams of panic. For a brief moment, Rio belonged not to the empire, but to those who had built it with their blood. Yet the revolt was not a single wave, but a series of sparks. Some groups surged forward, attacking isolated soldiers. Others tried to set fire to storehouses or free captives from jails. Rumors spread faster than fire. They are in the streets. The slaves are rising. Haiti has come to Rio. Panic gripped the masters, who locked themselves inside their mansions, clutching pistols and praying the uprising would pass them by. But the revolt faced its own limits. Many enslaved had only minutes to act before patrols closed in. Communication was fragmented. Not all groups rose at the same time. Some hesitated, fearing betrayal. Others were betrayed outright. Informants had warned authorities of the plot, and militias were waiting. Within hours, soldiers marched into the streets, muskets ready, bayonets gleaming. The air filled with smoke and the thunder of gunfire. Still, resistance was fierce. Fighters armed only with stones and machetes charged against trained troops. Capoeiras darted between shots, striking with kicks and blades before melting back into the crowd. Women hurled boiling water from windows, turned cooking pots into weapons, and shielded children from the chaos. The revolt may not have been organized like an army, but it burned with desperation and courage. By dawn, however, the balance shifted. Militias tightened their grip, cutting off streets, dragging captives from hiding places, and making examples of the wounded. Fires were stamped out. Shouts gave way to silence. What had seemed, for a few hours, like the rebirth of Haiti and Rio ended in chains and blood. Yet, even in defeat, the uprising left its mark. It proved what the masters feared most, that rebellion was not confined to distant plantations or remote jungles. It could erupt in the very heart of their capital, in the streets they walked every day. It showed that the enslaved were not isolated, not silent, not broken. They were watching, waiting, and capable of rising. The morning after the uprising, Rio de Janeiro awoke to smoke and silence. The fires of the night still smoldered in the streets, the scent of ash and gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. But the sound of defiance was gone. Soldiers now filled the avenues, muskets slung across their shoulders, bayonets gleaming in the rising sun. Where hours earlier enslaved voices had shouted in rebellion, now only the barked orders of the militia could be heard. The empire had struck back swiftly. Patrols combed through the alleys, dragging men from doorways, seizing women and children suspected of aiding the revolt. Shackled lines of captives were marched through the city, their heads bowed but their backs unbroken. Markets that had once been alive with the chatter of vendors now stood silent, as if the very soul of the city had been extinguished overnight. Justice, if such a word could be used, was swift and merciless. Trials were little more than theater. Enslaved men accused of leadership were paraded before magistrates, their guilt already decided. Torture was used to extract confessions, names, and stories that often confirmed the fears of the authorities rather than the truth. With every new confession, the net widened. Neighbors accused neighbors, bonds of trust shattered under the weight of pain. Executions followed, staged as public warnings. In the plazas where families once gathered to trade and gossip, gallows were raised. Men and women accused of conspiracy were hanged as crowds of masters and soldiers looked on. Some were whipped until their backs were raw, their screams echoing through the city. Others were branded, their flesh forever marked as traitors. The cruelty was not just punishment, it was theater. It was meant to remind every enslaved soul of the price of resistance. But the spectacle could not erase the fear that still lingered in the hearts of Rio's elite. They had seen their city tremble. They had seen rebellion not in far-off plantations, but in the streets outside their own homes. They knew, even as they watched the hangings, that the uprising could have been worse, that it might return, that the embers of revolt smoldered in places they could not see. For the enslaved, the aftermath was devastating. Families were torn apart, leaders silenced, and communities left traumatized. Brotherhoods and secret networks were hunted down. Capoeira groups were outlawed more aggressively. Gatherings of Africans monitored with new intensity. Every drumbeat, every whispered prayer, every coded glance was now suspect. Fear became law. And yet, in the shadows, resilience survived. Even as gallows claimed their victims, others carried the memory of the uprising forward. The revolt had shown them that the city was not invincible, that the masters, for all their weapons and laws, were vulnerable, that even in chains, one night of courage could shake an empire. The suppression of 1838 was brutal, but it did not kill the dream of freedom. If anything, it made it burn brighter, carried in silence, passed from one generation to the next. The revolt of 1838 did not succeed. By morning, it had been crushed beneath the weight of soldiers' boots and the gallows rope. Its leaders were silenced, its fighters punished, its networks scattered. To the ruling elite of Rio, it was a failure, a dangerous spark extinguished before it could grow into fire. But history is not written only in victories. Sometimes its power lies in memory. For the enslaved, memory was survival. The revolt became a story whispered in the dark, a tale passed from one generation to the next. Children heard of fathers who had fought in the streets, of mothers who had hidden messages in baskets, of friends who had fallen but not bowed. These stories were never written in official records. They lived instead in songs, in prayers, in the unspoken knowledge that others before them had dared to rise. For the masters, memory meant fear. The revolt reminded them that slavery was not stable, not safe, that even in the capital, where soldiers patrolled and laws tightened every day, rebellion could still erupt. The image of enslaved men seizing streets, women hurling boiling water from windows, and capoeiristas striking in alleys haunted the imagination of Rio's elite. They doubled their vigilance, passed harsher laws, and cracked down on gatherings. But repression was not proof of strength, it was proof of anxiety. In the decades that followed, Rio remained a city of contradictions: wealth and poverty, splendor and suffering, beauty and brutality. Other revolts would follow, some larger, some smaller, but each was part of a pattern, a rhythm of resistance that could not be erased. The revolt of 1838 was one beat in that rhythm, but it resonated. When Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, 50 years later, it was not a gift from rulers, but the result of centuries of struggle. Plantation uprisings, ship mutinies, maroon communities, urban revolts like Rio in 1838, all these threads wove together into the fabric of resistance that forced emancipation. The revolt may have failed in its immediate goal, but it succeeded in proving a truth that masters feared, that slavery was never accepted, never secure, and never unchallenged. Today, the revolt is little remembered in textbooks. It does not stand alongside Haiti or Nat Turner or Bahia in popular history. But its legacy lives in silence, in the recognition that resistance took many forms. It shows us that even the most ordinary enslaved person, a porter, a market seller, a capoeirista, could stand up against empire. That freedom was not only a dream, but a struggle carried out in the streets of Rio itself. The revolt of 1838 teaches us something else too, that power is fragile when built on chains. The gallows may have silenced voices, but they could not silence the idea of freedom. That idea lived on, carried in whispers, in songs, in prayers, and in time it would outlive the empire itself. The revolt in Rio de Janeiro in 1838 was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, a chorus of defiance echoing across the Atlantic world. To understand its significance, we must place it alongside other uprisings that shaped the age of slavery. The most obvious shadow was Haiti. Only 3 decades earlier, the enslaved of Saint-Domingue had risen in revolt, defeating Napoleon's armies and declaring independence. Haiti proved what was once thought impossible, that an enslaved people could overthrow their masters and build a free republic. Its influence was both inspiration and terror. For the enslaved, Haiti was a beacon. For the masters, it was a nightmare that haunted every plantation and every port. The Rio Revolt was born in the same atmosphere of fear and hope. Closer to home, the Bahian revolts had already rocked Brazil. The Malê uprising of 1835, led by African Muslims in Salvador, was one of the largest urban revolts in the Americas. Like Rio, it was a revolt of the city, not the countryside, proving that resistance could emerge where slavery was most visible. The memory of Bahia lingered in Rio's streets. Every whisper of rebellion carried its echoes. Beyond Brazil, other uprisings showed that resistance was never bound by geography. In Jamaica, the Baptist War of 1831 involved more than 60,000 enslaved people, shaking the foundations of the British Empire and hastening emancipation. In the United States, Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831 terrified Virginia planters, while the Stono Rebellion of 1739 had already proven that enslaved Africans could march and fight as disciplined groups. In Suriname and Guyana, maroon communities waged decades-long guerrilla wars, carving out spaces of freedom in the forests. What tied these struggles together was not communication in the modern sense, but a shared condition of bondage and a shared dream of freedom. Ideas traveled across the seas with sailors, traders, and fugitives. Rumors spread faster than ships. A hymn in Jamaica, a prayer in Bahia, a whispered story in Rio. All carried fragments of resistance. The Rio Revolt of 1838 may not have been as large as Jamaica, as famous as Haiti, or as organized as Bahia, but it belonged to the same world. It proved that the desire for freedom was not bound by plantation rows or jungle hideouts. It thrived in ports, in marketplaces, in the very capitals of empire. For historians, the lesson is clear. There was no place where slavery went unchallenged. Every colony, every city, every plantation had its acts of defiance, small or large, whispered or shouted. Rio's revolt reminds us that even in the heart of imperial Brazil, rebellion was possible. And in that sense, the enslaved of Rio were not alone. They were part of a global struggle, one that stretched from Africa to the Americas, from the streets of Salvador to the hills of Jamaica, from the rice fields of South Carolina to the sugarcane of Haiti. A struggle that would, in time, break the chains of millions. When we talk about the Rio Slave Revolt of 1838, one challenge becomes immediately clear. Whose voices do we hear, and whose voices have been silenced? Almost all of the surviving records come from the pens of the powerful, from magistrates, from newspapers owned by the elite, from military reports designed to justify repression. The enslaved themselves, who lived and breathed the revolt, left almost nothing written behind. Their words were suppressed, their testimonies distorted, their memory buried. Colonial officials framed the uprising as chaos, criminality, or madness. Newspapers exaggerated its scale to stoke fear, then downplayed its meaning to reassure the public. Court transcripts are filled with confessions extracted under torture, stories that tell us more about what the authorities wanted to believe than what actually happened. Did dozens rise, or hundreds? Was there a clear plan? Or was it a sudden explosion of rage? The truth lies somewhere in the silence between the lines. This silence has fueled debate among historians. Some argue that the Rio Revolt was a small, disorganized outburst, quickly contained and of little consequence. Others insist that it was part of a broader pattern, an urban expression of resistance linked to Bahia, Haiti, and the wider Atlantic struggle. The lack of sources makes certainty impossible, but uncertainty does not mean insignificance. In recent decades, historians have turned to new methods to recover the enslaved perspective. They piece together fragments, runaway slave advertisements, church records, police logs, even songs and oral traditions that survived into the 20th century. From these fragments, a more complex picture emerges. It shows enslaved people not as passive victims, but as actors who planned, communicated, and resisted in ways the official record tried to erase. The debate is not just academic, it touches on how nations remember or choose to forget their past. In Brazil, slavery lasted longer than almost anywhere else in the Americas, ending only in 1888. For decades afterward, the myth persisted that emancipation was a gift from enlightened rulers rather than the result of centuries of struggle. Stories like the Rio Revolt disrupt that myth. They remind us that freedom was not granted, it was demanded, fought for, and paid for in blood. So when historians argue over numbers or strategies, the deeper truth remains. The revolt mattered. It mattered because it showed that resistance could emerge anywhere. It mattered because it terrified the ruling elite into harsher laws, proving their insecurity. And it mattered because even in silence, the memory of defiance endured. In the end, the historian's task is not only to sift through archives, but to listen for the voices that those archives tried to erase, to imagine, carefully but firmly, the perspective of those who carried water by day and planned rebellion by night. To give back to the enslaved of Rio the dignity of being remembered as fighters, not just as victims. The debate continues, but the very act of debating keeps the memory alive. And in that sense, history itself becomes an act of resistance. Though the revolt of 1838 ended in chains and silence, its echoes did not fade. They lingered in whispers, in fears, and in memories carried forward by generations. What began as a single night of resistance in Rio would ripple outward, shaping Brazil's path to emancipation and leaving traces still visible today. In the years after the uprising, Rio's elite tightened their grip. Laws became harsher, patrols more aggressive, punishments more public. But these measures betrayed a truth. The revolt had unsettled the very foundations of the city. If enslaved people could rise in the capital, nowhere was safe. Planners and politicians spoke often of vigilance, of the need to prevent another Haiti. Their fear was the revolt's most lasting victory. For the enslaved, the revolt became part of an underground heritage of struggle. Stories were carried in secret gatherings, in the rhythms of drums, in the movements of capoeira. Mothers told their children of fathers who had fought. Elders reminded the young that freedom was worth the price of blood. Even if the revolt was rarely recorded in books, it was inscribed in memory. Decades later, when the abolitionist movement gained strength in the 1870s and 1880s, echoes of 1838 resurfaced. Black intellectuals, freedmen, and activists pointed to a long history of resistance, proof that slavery had never been accepted. They argued that every revolt, however crushed, was a step toward the Golden Law of 1888, which formally abolished slavery in Brazil. Abolition was not the benevolence of an emperor. It was the result of centuries of unrest. Even after abolition, the legacy lived on in Rio's culture. In the hillsides where freed slaves settled, communities preserved African traditions that had once been criminalized. Samba rhythms, born of drums that once beat in secrecy, became Brazil's national sound. Capoeira, once outlawed as a weapon of rebellion, transformed into a celebrated art form, its kicks and spins a living memory of survival. In these cultural forms, one can still hear the echo of 1838, the spirit of defiance translated into rhythm, movement, and celebration. And today, when Brazil reckons with its history of slavery, the longest in the Americas, the Rio Revolt reminds us of a critical truth. Slavery did not collapse because it was unsustainable economically or because rulers grew merciful. It collapsed because the enslaved never stopped resisting. Their courage, even in failed revolts, weakened the chains until they finally broke. The 1838 revolt may not be widely remembered in monuments or textbooks, but its essence lives on. In every capoeira rota, in every samba beat, in every demand for racial justice in modern Brazil, the voices of those who fought in Rio's streets still speak. They remind us that freedom was never given. It was taken again and again until it became impossible to deny. The night of rebellion in Rio was short, but its echo is long, carrying across centuries into our own time. History is often told through the eyes of the powerful, emperors, generals, and rulers. But the story of the Rio Slave Revolt of 1838 reminds us that true history is also carried in the footsteps of the forgotten, the dockworker who dropped his rope to raise a blade, the market woman who risked her life to pass a message, the capoeirista who turned rhythm into resistance. They were silenced in their own time, but they are not silent now. Every rebellion, no matter how brief, was a cry that pierced through the darkness of slavery. Every act of defiance, whether in the cane fields of Haiti, the mountains of Jamaica, or the streets of Rio, was part of the same struggle, a fight for dignity, for memory, for freedom. If this story moved you, if it made you see Rio not only as a city of beaches and beauty, but also as a place where enslaved men and women dared to fight, then don't let their memory fade again. This channel exists to bring those hidden voices back, to ensure they are remembered not as shadows in history, but as human beings who changed it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next untold chapter of slavery's dark past. Share this video so others may understand how deeply resistance shaped the world we live in today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, your reflections. Dialogue keeps memory alive. The past still speaks. Together we can make sure it is heard.